Today we're visiting one of the great national galleries of the world. It may not be as big as some European national galleries, but it is encyclopaedic. It's actually a non-governmental department, so it's run by the state. It's free to enter. It started in 1824, but didn't nationalise a gallery. They actually made a purchase of 38 paintings from the heirs of John Julius Angerstein, and that 38 pictures has grown to 2,300. But as we see here, we've come up the stairs, and just to the left we go into the old Sainsbury Gallery, which is full of Renaissance art, and we have here the Virgin of the Rocks by Da Vinci. It's a sumptuous painting. A few years ago they had an exhibition of Da Vinci and actually featured the Louvre and the National Gallery's copies, both of which were painted by Da Vinci, and they had them either end of the room, and you could sit on the bench in the middle and look in between and see the subtle ways in which his art improved and changed over the intervening years. Hidden behind it is another Da Vinci. It's a sketch and it's almost impossible to photograph, so you'll have to bear with me, and I promise the pictures do get better, or the photography does. I can't speak for the art, but here, hidden away, is the Madonna and Child with Saint Anne and a young Saint John. It's a gorgeously detailed sketch. What I'm going to try and do today is something a little bit different. I see the National Gallery as almost an encyclopedic collection of world art, showing the transformation of world art from late pre-Renaissance art in Italy through to the 1900s and the birth of Impressionism. So we're going to follow that path more than specifically the gallery. And art is always objective, so I'm going to point out, maybe hesitate a little bit, on the paintings which I enjoy. I would say come to the National Gallery. It really is an excellent collection. If you've watched this far, then you will enjoy it. I've taken people who don't consider themselves to appreciate or like art, and they loved it. The first few rooms are, I'd argue, pre-Renaissance. They show Italy before the birth of the Renaissance, and you can see it's all religion. It's all saint this, saint that, Jesus, Mary. That's the only topic. There's a certain naivety in terms of scale and detailing. Although there's beautiful detailing on the robes, you see a marked difference when the Renaissance begins of a level of anatomical detail, a level of precision, and away goes this scale, which, yes, you could say this has a religious meaning, that the saints are less senior, but there is a marked difference, and we'll see it shortly. I think this is very pretty. I appreciate it, but really for me, art in the sense of modern art begins with the likes of Da Vinci. But it's a wonderful collection here. I came here before I went to Florence and spent about half a day just in this one half of the museum in the Sainsbury wing, and there is a beautiful collection of religious Italian art, fantastically displayed, really covers every famous Italian painter from the period that you've ever heard of, and plenty who you haven't. But really for me it kicks off shortly. I'm going to skip through some of these paintings, just give you an impression of the early Italian collection. And suddenly we start to see more detail. It's like we've jumped a century. Look at the painting there of Jesus praying. Look at the Doge, the level of detail. It's almost photographic. It's a completely different medium to the first few rooms. Again, it's still predominantly religious, but you start to see a change in that. There are scenes of everyday life. There are religious scenes, but in an Italian Renaissance setting. Here, this wonderful painting, I've actually seen its twin in the Uffizi. It's Paolo-Cello's The Battle of San Romano, and really is gorgeous. You look next to it here at St. George, here at Satyr. You're starting to get less religious and more mythical. The range of acceptable subjects is expanding, and I think that's part of the evolution of art during this period, where you could paint reality or you could paint a mythic dream, but it had to have a power and a meaning. Art had suddenly grown up. You look at these masterpieces and you think, how would you paint that? Whereas the earlier work, you possibly could conceive of being able to. I can tell you I can't. If I could paint, I'd be painting, not doing videos. But it's such a step change. It's like a new world has opened. I think in many ways that's why we think of it as the Renaissance, as the rebirth of civilization and culture. And I'd say the curators of this museum, when the collection was not necessarily collected but specifically displayed, it shows sort of Alan Clark's father wrote Civilization, and he was the curator of the National Gallery when he wrote that series, and it gives that perspective of the foundation of the modern world being the Italian Renaissance in many ways, culturally. See the level of detail here on a Martyrdom of San Sebastian. It was actually an altarpiece by the brothers Antonio and Piero della Palaulo. I'm sure I murdered that name. This was commissioned by the Pucci family for their altar in their private chapel. You see here the Madonna, the pudgy baby that has those sort of rolls of baby fat. There's a level of detail that before they were very much more flat and two-dimensional. There's a wonderful room of portraits, and it kind of keys in the evolution of art during this period. And you see here the portrait of a young man by Sandro Botticelli. You see the details like you would in a portrait photo. There's not perfection. There's actually the perfection of imperfection, the proper portrait that shows a person as they actually are. Here from 1430s, the Arnolfini portrait by Van Dyck, and you see a very accurate portrayal of a couple. The room's actually not that accurate. When you start looking at items like the chandelier and the placement of the walls, it's a false background drawn to show the wealth of the family. It's a merchant family showing their wealth without calling out aristocratic wealth, because they weren't aristocrats. I guess they were nouveau riche. They could afford Van Dyck to tell people how rich they were. If anything, that painting's a little bit out of keeping with the room, which is purely Italian. But the Renaissance is starting to spread. You see the range of subjects still largely biblical, but you see a very different portrayal of the characters. It's no longer just Jesus and saints and religious topics and occasionally mythology, but there's also commissions to paint real people, to show them as they are, as they want to be, as they want people to see them, and general portraiture. There's some beautiful portraits here, although I can't say that's one of them. The Ugly Duchess is actually a satirical portrait painted by the Flemish artist Quentin Matisse about 1513. And again you see the beautiful robes, the detail of the textile, the way it falls is measured and drawn and perceived as it actually is. It's art as an expression of a perfected form of reality. Even that painting of the Ugly Duchess, there's a beauty in it. This is the view of art. When people say, is that art? Well, what's art is in the eye of the beholder. This is all ascribing to the school of thought that art is about beauty, about being beautiful. Even the Ugly Duchess is beautiful in its own way. You look at the brush strokes and the accuracy of the sketching, and it is art is beauty. Keats the poet said that beauty is an imaginative journey into his own soul, starting with his senses and ending with his poetry. This is that same thought process, that same philosophy, but in paint. I guess that's why I probably wouldn't put any of the pictures, or let's face it, a poster of any of these pictures on my wall at home. But I do always enjoy this section. It's a beautiful encyclopaedic collection of Italian art from the birth of modern art. And I use modern in the loose sense, not in the sense of modern art, which is more across the river. There's a little bit of what you could call modern post-impressionist art later on, but look at the detail there. Or here, the light on the woman feeding her baby. Jesus, his bright blue robes. I always start with this rooms because this wing of the gallery is effectively the foundation of the art that's painted in the rest of the National Gallery. Within a couple of hundred years, the painting of Diana hunting would have been very different, but the technique, the approach, the understanding of anatomy, the attempt to not just paint a picture that you can recognise, but a picture which has a level of detail and accuracy that you can reach an emotional engagement with the painter's work. This work lays that foundation. Here, Bacchus and Ariadne by Titian. Here another Titian, Noli Me Tangere, and I don't mean the book by Jose Rizal. It's Mary Magdalene in the Garden of Gethsemane, reaching out to Jesus and mistaking him for a gardener, and he says, "Do not touch me." These works by Titian, they lack the scale of his work in the Doge's Palace in Venice, but there's a recognisable talent. There's a use of light and colour and a level of detail. Here, Correggio's Madonna and Baby. Beautiful collection here. It's a rather dark room. The Dream of the Night by Raphael. Really gorgeous area here. Art has evolved. And we see here in the next room, very different, the Dutch masters, and really wonderful collection of Dutch scenes, and recognisably so. I believe that's Haarlem Cathedral. The lady playing on the harpsichord. These are famous, instantly recognisable. Johannes Vermeer's two paintings, a young lady seated at a virginal and a young woman standing at a virginal. They show how Caravaggio's work has transferred through and crossed over to Holland. Just as the Dutch were becoming rich and wealthy merchants and wishing to express their culture, not just wealth. The same as in Florence, really, under the Medici, where the Renaissance really flowered. When we make a trip to the Victoria and Albert Museum in a few weeks, we're going to see the first work of art of the Renaissance, arguably. It's a plaster cast of it, not the real one. And it's actually Lorenzo Ghiberti's doors of the baptistry at the Duomo. And Florence wanted to express its culture and civilization and show its wealth. Those two things intertwined just as they were in Holland. The merchant class not wanting to be seen as nouveau riche plebs, but sponsors of culture. Here, Rubens' rape of the Sabine women, really striking the physicality and energy of the event, captured even more maybe than the statue by another Flemish sculptor done for Cosimo de' Medici, the rape of the Sabines in the Loggia in Florence. We see here a series of studies, and in the room next to it I love the seascapes and landscapes of Northern Europe. You see here a series of seascapes by Vernet and Joseph Mallord William Turner, Albert Cuyp, Dordrecht. Very striking portrayals of the wildness and virility of the sea. They're stunning. Even today, this is still a beautiful picture of a storm. And you can see early example of very different to my favourite painting in this gallery, which is also by Turner, but you'll have to watch to the end to find out which one that is. You see rustic idyllic scenes and austere ladies. Rather dashing cavalier there. Fascinating paintings, a style of portraiture which is really elevated from the initial paintings of rulers that we saw in the Sainsbury wing. But they're fascinating studies. They feel like a window back through time to an era long gone in Northern Europe, where you see a view, a slice of time in Holland. At one stage idealised, at another stage realistic, showing you how people dressed. Think of this like Victorian paintings of people in their Sunday best. There's a lot of pictures of people from the Victorian era, photographs when photography was first spreading, and they look like they normally looked, just obviously how they looked on their Sunday best, not their probably everyday life. Whereas there's a more gritty reality today where people don't get dressed up so much for a photo, more taking selfies as they roll. Here a beautiful collection of Rembrandts, the friar, the woman bathing. There's actually a self-portrait here we'll find in a minute. There it is, just to the right, next to the woman bathing. But there's a level of detail, but also a lightness of the brushwork. It's a feeling of light and shade, not so much the texture of the clothing. And here is the artist himself, not dressed up as being fancy and a beautiful man. He's painting himself as he sees himself. At the same time, there's that use of darkness and light that you see very much in Caravaggio's work. And Caravaggio's work was very influential with the Dutch painters, as we can see here with Balthazar's Feast, a really sumptuous painting. The movement, the detail, the choice of light and shade, it's very reminiscent for me of some of Caravaggio's best paintings. And compare that to where we started in the first room. The level of detail, action, feeling has elevated so much in that short period of a few hundred years. This room finishes off the Dutch schools. Beautiful portraits. You see a completely different medium to the first few rooms. Totally different subjects. Totally different honesty and frankness about the people being portrayed. And a use of light and shade which really evolves further as we move on. The still lifes, they're striking. I've got to say, I've never really liked still life on my wall, but they are particularly good examples. I love this one. It's a young woman with a display of fruit and vegetables by Frans Hals, and it's the only surviving example that we know Hals collaborated with another painter, because it's signed by his Haarlem colleague Claes van Huysen. I'm no connoisseur of Dutch art, but certainly the best collection of Dutch art that I've seen outside of Amsterdam. Here, I love these musician, and here he is. Beautiful piece. You can see the religious scenes are still being painted, but with a level of realism and detail that even in the Renaissance, or certainly the early Renaissance, wasn't present. I've always thought one of the reasons that Dutch art during this period is so appreciated is the way it evolved from the Italian Renaissance, where a level of quality was present which you didn't really see quite yet in other countries. And I do think a lot of that's tied to the economy. The wealth of the merchants led to a class of people who wanted to seek prestige the same way that the Silicon Valley crowd want to have the cool playthings. I guess these were the yachts of their day. And certainly very striking art, which even 600 years later really stands out as pure quality. I love these landscapes here. Now we're moving into French art here with Claude, a seaport. So it's a tranquil port scene just bathed in sunlight. It's gorgeous. It's an imaginary scene, but it doesn't take much thought to realise that the buildings are based on Italian architecture and dates from 1644. Continuing with the French artists, there's two very striking paintings of Cardinal Richelieu, the power behind the throne and that bad guy in the Three Musketeers. The triple portrait is by Philippe de Campagne and Studio, and the single portrait is by Philippe de Campagne. And they're from his time, painted from him. I particularly like this triple. It's a very striking three perspectives on a very important and difficult to decipher man. After a few more still lifes, which I skipped over, there's the Italian landscape paintings. And they're striking in the sheer detail and subtleness to them, along with these religious paintings. Again, you can see they're much later than those in the Sainsbury wing, and there's a development of light and shade and scale. but there still may be an Italianness about them. Italian portrayals of religious subjects always have more pious pain, I feel, than some of the Spanish work, where the Spanish, there's piety, but there's more of an aspirational, there's a lost in thought in the expressions rather than pained in the Italian. Maybe it's just me seeing that, but beautiful collection of Spanish work, particularly here, the Rokeby Venus, painted by Velázquez somewhere between 1647 and 1651. It almost reminds me of pre-impressionist French paintings of nudes, much different to the Venus de Milo or other Italian paintings of Venus. But there's a physicality and a detail to it. It's a gorgeous painting. And this beautiful painting of the Holy Family, it's actually the Heavenly and Earthly Trinities by Bartolomeo Esteban Murillo. It's a gorgeous painting, and you can see the level of detail. If you look down into the paintwork, you see almost imperceptible brush strokes. And there's so many beautiful paintings here, you'll probably realise I'm skipping a few, but I'm trying to show my favourites in that sort of evolution of art, as I think the National Gallery shows it. And Canaletto is probably one of my favourite artists. The level of detail and precision, it's almost photographic. You can feel the texture of the planks of wood there, and you get that sense of Venice, the Arsenale, the Grand Canal. Even if you go in, you can see the ripples of water on the Grand Canal. There we go, absolutely gorgeous. If you really like Canaletto's, I'd recommend the collection at Chatsworth House. Though this painting, the Regatta on the Grand Canal, is probably one of his finest works. You can see even the headscarves on the gondoliers, the ripples in the water, the subtle details in the carving on the Doge's boat, and just a hint of the Bridge of Sighs. It's a small collection of Canaletto's, but they are excellent examples. St. Mark's Square there. Really. From the other end, that's the same view today. If you go to the Archaeology Museum, you get effectively that view out of the window. Now you have formal portraiture. There's a good selection here of female portraits that have been specially curated as part of the reopening of the National Gallery, because the National Gallery's been under renovation for some time. Lovely Gainsborough there. As we get to the far end of the National Gallery, one of the most striking changes is actually this room here. But before we talk about that, here's a very striking painting. It reminds me of the Lunar Men. Joseph Wright of Derby. He painted this, an experiment of a bird in an air pump, and it shows a candlelit experiment explaining the effect of withdrawing the air. I remember as a teenager thinking the expressions on the faces were particularly good. This wonderful painting by Stubbs of a horse has been shuffled along the wall a little bit. Now it stands framed the length of the gallery by the doorway into this room. It's a very famous painting. There's a lovely collection of Gainsborough's portraits, a view of a period of British history. Here, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews by Gainsborough, along with a series of smaller but stunning little paintings which have been rearranged into this room. This room used to have down this end the constables and turners, which they've been moved over to a side corridor, which seems a slightly odd choice, but I do like the overall layout of the new curation. Here, Claude Joseph Vernet, beautiful painting of a shipwreck in a stormy sea, landscapes of idyllic. There's Eton at the top there. That's Eton seen from Windsor. Now there's hedges blocking the way and various buildings, but a stunning painting. Now art's evolved much more into an almost photographic level of detail. There's a standard and a quality, but then artists rebelled against that, and we're going to get to that. We see hints of it in the Turners in a minute. Here, John Constable's painting of a cenotaph to the memory of Sir Joshua Reynolds, with a stag standing next to it, and needing no introduction, the Hay Wain by Constable really captures an idyllic view of England past, as does the cornfield with the young shepherd boy grasping some drink from a pond. Really beautiful collection. It's slightly strange that the Constable's been moved here. Now, we're about to see my favourite painting in this whole gallery. Sadly, it's not this one. This is Turner, very much changing from the earlier painting we saw, moving towards Impressionism, inspired by the French. This is a steam engine running through a storm of pollution. You can see the impact of the Industrial Revolution, very much contrasted with Constable's idyllic rural England, which sits directly opposite. If, like me, you're fond of Turner, check out the video on the Tate Britain, which has definitely the best collection of Turners I've ever seen anywhere. And here on the left is my favourite painting in the whole of this National Gallery. Not that left, the next one over. It's the Fighting Temeraire. It's a stunning picture, I think. It's Turner experimenting with Impressionism, still not too full blown, so you can still tell exactly what it is. And the Fighting Temeraire is the last sail ship of the line of the English Navy being towed away for destruction. It's the end of an era, the movement from the pre-industrial revolution to the post-industrial revolution, the end of an epoch, and it's captured in this beautiful sunset. It's the sun going down on the age of steam. Contrast this with the highly detailed and idyllic image of an England which probably never existed, which Constable portrays on the wall opposite. And here the Execution of Lady Jane Grey by Paul de la Roche. If you watched our Monday Museum tour of the Guildhall, we actually saw the much smaller study which was used to get the layout and design and tone and shade, but it's actually to the same quality, really. This is just stunning for its scale. And Francisco de Goya's painting, a portrait of the Duke of Wellington, painted just after he entered Madrid victorious, having defeated the French during the Peninsular War. You can see a sureness and maybe an arrogance about him. It's quite a fascinating study of one of Britain's greatest generals and greatest statesmen. There's not that many portraits of famous British people here, largely probably because the National Portrait Gallery next door, which we did a video on a few months ago, has an extensive collection. But here, this room has some interesting portraits and a series of studies and paintings by Constable, some beautiful landscapes. I think I recognise one of those there. So castle just near Southend, but beautiful small studies of landscapes around Britain and obviously Holland and the Low Countries. There's a room full of gorgeous paintings here, but we're going to skip through because now we're moving on to the next great movement in art, and Impressionism. Now, if you really love Impressionism, you have to go to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. It's basically a room of 40 pictures by Degas, followed by 40 by Rodin, 40 by Renoir, 40 by Monet, and it goes on. It's a beautiful collection. But certainly in Britain, this is the best collection of Impressionist art that I've seen. And it's lovely. It shows the beginnings, the early Impressionism, where there starts to be a more brutal brushstrokes. They're giving a feeling, but you can still tell it's a tree. Let's put it that way. Whereas as we progress, Impressionism becomes more about painting with light. But here with the music in the Tuileries Gardens, Edouard Monet, you can still see exactly the details and what you're looking at. The execution of Maximilian, here you see the details of the story, the soldier cocking his gun, and the execution taking place. And as we move along, you start to see more stabbing impressions, hence Impressionism, right, of colour and shape, portrayed by less detail. Less is more. The mind fills in what it sees. It progresses particularly with landscapes as you get into these snowscapes and the station there. The steam and the snow is more ethereal, but a beautiful selection of early Impressionist art where you start to see almost the detail degrading. And contrast these two, the skiff or l'Aïeul and the umbrellas, both by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Compare the water here, painted with dabs rather than inked in every little wave like Canaletto. Or Edouard Monet's paintings of Paris street life as his corner of a cafe concert. And Degas' dancers, the beautiful ballerinas that he painted. Here's some examples of the pastels that were used, and these are actually pastels from the time, not actually his. Look at that stunning picture of the ballerinas, the movement and the colour, the shade. You see, the detail is degrading. It's becoming more about how you feel about the art than being a perfect capture of reality. Yet at the same time, when the person paying wants detail, they get detail. And now we're moving into some of the busiest rooms in the museum, Van Gogh and Monet. And here you see the very famous painting of Van Gogh's chair. There's a striking simplicity, and definitely if you like Van Gogh, you have to either go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam or the Musée d'Orsay, preferably both. You see these beautiful Provençal paintings. If the crowd's anything to judge by, the Van Goghs are one of the star attractions, particularly the chair and the sunflowers, which we will see in a moment. There's a sense of joy in these Van Goghs, which is so much at contrast with his life. Here's the sunflowers, which I promised. Always surrounded by tourists taking selfies. Yes, I saw it. And here the lovely scenery. This is probably the Van Gogh that I like. Gives you an impression of southern France. And Degas' Miss La La at the Cirque Fernando gives that impression of La Belle Époque. So we head through to the next gallery. George Seurat's famous Bathers at Asnières, his first major composition. It's a gorgeous painting which captures that dappled paintwork where there's the impression of what's happening, but you can still very much see what you're seeing. It's not left to the title of the painting like post-impressionism. Beautiful painting. Here you can still see, I love this one, the Alpine view. Here it's almost mirror-like lake. For me, this is probably the impressionism I love. The impression is there, but there's still the detail. It appeals to the soul in a way that pre-impressionist art often didn't, but at the same time you're not left scratching your head wondering what you're looking at. Maybe I'm a Philistine for saying that. The collection shows the evolution continuing of Impressionism, moving over with a jolt to Surprised or a tiger in a tropical storm, with it's almost like a paint by pictures depiction from a children's colouring book, and I mean that in a very complimentary way. There's a stunning naivety, and at the same time it's such striking colours. Whereas you see here I'm a bit more, what is that? Okay, does he really look like that? Whereas the tiger in a tropical storm, it's just a very punchy painting. And here very different, Degas combing the hair with this bright orgy of red, which traditionally represented promiscuity and deviousness and sensuality in art. Compare that to such a completely different work in the same room. This is one of my favourites here. In a matter of one lifetime, even one career, Impressionism turned everything on its head, from the accentuated detail of the post-Renaissance movements through to the initial dabblings of the Impressionists, and then all of the detail is gone, and you have this emotional canvas with Monet's water lilies. If you like these, you have to go to the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. They have a wonderful water lilies which encompasses the entire oval shaped rooms. And here beautiful landscapes by Claude Monet. Different levels of perception and detail, but all very loving of nature. And really we're coming to the end, just last few rooms at the National Gallery. And as I walked out, I wanted to finish at the Ambassadors, a much earlier work by Holbein, which shows the same experimentation which we see in Impressionism, but more constrained by artistic mores. And I hope you've enjoyed our visit to the National Gallery. Not showing you all the paintings, hopefully given a feel for how it now looks. I just wanted to leave you with a few of my favourite paintings here. The Fighting Temeraire by Turner. The Industrial Revolution with the train running over a viaduct. The experiment with the air being withdrawn from the bell jar. The umbrellas, I had that on a poster at university. Exquisite portrait of a lady at the theatre. Revellers and drinkers in a Parisian bar. The bridge in Monet's actual garden. Goya's portrait of a Duke of Wellington. Constable's hay wain. Stubbs' horse. Really stunning collection of paintings, and as I said at the beginning, an encyclopaedic collection of the history of art as it evolved from the Italian pre-Renaissance through Holland, Spain, Northern Europe, Britain, and really right up to the 19th century with wonders of Impressionism. So please do like and subscribe, and join us next week for another museum tour. And go to the National Gallery, check it out. They've recently renovated it, and I think they've done an excellent job, as you can see. And after 250 years, hopefully they've preserved its place as one of the great galleries of the world.